Hey everyone, we're starting with medieval vegetables tonight. I know, exciting, but not these veggies. So, before you get too comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And please tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who is joining us from all over the world. Now, turn down the lights and maybe turn on a fan to make a soft background noise. Let's get ready for our journey tonight. Medieval authorities didn't trust plants like purslane very much, not because it poisoned people, started riots, or worshipped the devil, but because it wouldn't act like a normal crop. It didn't fit together in a neat way. It didn't ask for permission. It didn't even act like it cared who owned the land. Plain looked like an uninvited guest who also happens to be a better cook than you. It did well in dry weather. It didn't care about bad soil. It grew in cracks between stones, on roads, and in courtyards, and sometimes in places that made people look down and say, "How is that even possible?" Peasants in the Middle Ages didn't plant purslane. That would mean putting in some work. One day, they saw it and realized it hadn't died, even though everything was working against it. They made the smart choice to eat it. Plain was already ahead of most medieval decision-making processes by a long way. Lane was almost offensive in terms of nutrition. At one point, it was full of vitamins, minerals, and healthy fats. When most diets were just bread, regret, and anything that boiled long enough to stop fighting back. It stayed green even when good vegetables fell apart under the mild pressure of reality. It didn't need fertilizer, water, or speeches to get people excited. It just was, which was seen as strange behavior in medieval farming. And this is where things got awkward. Food was supposed to come from farms. They measured the fields. Taxes were put on fields. There were responsibilities that came with fields. Plain didn't do any of that. It made walls into grocery stores and roadsides into pantries. No lord gave it. There was no priest who blessed it. No steward could count it without bending down and saying he had lost control of the situation. So, as people always do, when they find something useful but annoying, the authorities did what they always do. They said it was a weed. Weed isn't a scientific word, it is a feeling. This plant is breaking the rules and doing too well. Purslane quietly grew in monastic gardens because monks liked food that didn't die out of spite. It was praised in medical books. It was used by healers, but it was scary that peasants could eat it whenever they wanted. A peasant who didn't need grain didn't panic when there wasn't enough. And calm peasants have always made people nervous. So plain wasn't loudly banned. People ignored it on purpose, forgot about it on purpose, and made fun of it politely. It's hard to kill a plant that grows everywhere, but it's much easier to convince people that it's worthless. And PC Lane, it kept growing, no matter how stubborn it was, waiting for people to remember that they had made a mistake. Salsify was never showy. It didn't call for attention. It didn't grow in a proud, obvious way. If you only looked at it, you might think it had already failed. Above ground, Salafi looked thin, unimpressive, and a little sorry, like a plant that had come to the medieval food system but knew it wouldn't be taken seriously. But underground, Sifi was quietly doing well. Its long, strong root went deep into the ground, where it was safe from frost, drought, grazing animals, and the general chaos of medieval farming. When the weather turned bad, other crops panicked. But Salafi stayed calm and kept doing its job below the surface, gathering nutrients and waiting for someone smart enough to dig it up. Peasants in the Middle Ages figured this out quickly. Salafi didn't need soil that was rich. It didn't need to be watched all the time. It didn't break down emotionally during a cold snap. You planted it once and then mostly forgot about it, which made it very useful, but also very suspicious. Because this is the issue. Medieval farming systems liked to see people working hard. They liked fields that passing officials could check out, count, tax, and admire because they needed to feel useful. Salafi was hiding. It was hard to tell how much was growing. You couldn't tell who had more. You couldn't scare peasants by saying you would take their crops when half of. It was literally underground, minding its own business. Salafi was even worse because it was healthy. It gave people enough food to get through lean months without having to beg for grain from centralized stores. This wasn't the plan. The plan called for peasants to be hungry, scared, and ready to obey. Medical writers said that salsify was strengthening and restorative, which should have been a compliment, but it only made people more suspicious of it. Food that healed people made them less. Need for expensive cures and charitable organizations and medieval power structures were very interested in being needed. Salsify slowly fell out of favor, not because of bans or big decisions, but because people stopped caring about it. People said it was out of style, old-fashioned, and only for desperate times. Something you ate when there wasn't any better food around, which made it easy for people to not admit that it worked perfectly. Calcify stayed humble and forgettable above ground. It fed below ground. People through bad years and winters. And like a lot of things from the Middle Ages, it wasn't taken out because it didn't work. It was taken down because it worked too facile for anyone to stop it. Lovage was like that one friend who was good at everything and was hated for it in the Middle Ages. It was a plant that could be used as a vegetable, a herb, and a medicine all at once. This made it hard for people who liked clear categories and neat control. Love didn't care about limits. It made food taste better and helped with stomach problems. Problems, pain, and the fact that it grew back every year like it had signed a long-term lease with the soil. This plant was huge for a herb. Tall, leafy, and sure of itself. You didn't need a lot of it because lovage was strong. It was suspicious right away because it worked so well with so little. Medieval systems liked crops that needed a lot of work, supervision, and reminders of who was in charge. Lovage came and did what it was supposed to do. It was a hit with peasants. It made food that wasn't very good taste less like punishment. It was helpful. Digestion after meals that were mostly bread and good thoughts. It also made people less dependent on apothecaries, healers, and monastery medicine chests. This was good for peasants, but bad for institutions that liked being the only ones who could help. Medical books openly praised lovage. It was suggested for bloating, pain, and general bodily discomfort, which was pretty much everything in medieval times. Monasteries cultivated it within enclosed spaces, allowing for the meticulous management and dissemination of knowledge. But peasants, people who grew lovage freely in their gardens, thought it was too much, even empowering. Lovage also had the nerve to make the soil healthier. It brought in helpful bugs, kept the ground cool, and worked well with nearby plants. This wasn't how farming was supposed to work. It was normal for crops to have trouble. Struggle made the hierarchy make sense. A plant that made life easier went against the story. There was also the problem of superstition. Lovage was linked to love, attraction, and feelings. Well-being, which upset medieval leaders. People were suspicious of anything that made peasants happy, comfortable, or confident. People who were happy asked questions, so lovage wasn't banned in a big way. No one marched into gardens and yelled orders. Instead, it was slowly framed as too much, old-fashioned, or medicinal instead of food-related. Something useful in small amounts, preferably with someone watching. Of course, peasants adapted. They always did. But as time went on, lovage slipped into. The margins, which were only vaguely remembered, were used quietly and were eventually replaced by weaker, easier-to-use options. Not because lovage was dangerous, but because it made people too at ease. And throughout history, those in charge have always been worried about comfort. Skirret was sweet, starchy, and very dependable. Three things that made it immediately different from what people in the Middle Ages expected from farming. It grew clusters of long, pale roots that tasted sweet when cooked, which made it seem suspiciously fun. In medieval times, people thought that food was only good if you were very rich or very drunk. Skirret did well in cold weather and didn't mind wet soil, frost, or being ignored. Skirret kept growing underground even when other crops were unhappy and failed at the first sign of trouble. It seemed like it saw winter as a personal challenge. It didn't need land that was rich. It didn't need to be cared for all the time. It didn't freak out when things went wrong. People just saw it when they needed it the most. Of course, peasants loved it. Skirret filled people up when there wasn't enough grain. It gave people calories without having to rely on bread that the Lord controlled. It thrived in areas where wheat would not grow. And the worst part was that it took patience, not work. You planted it once and waited, so peasants weren't always in the fields, sweating and following orders. That last part was very upsetting. Medieval systems favored crops that required constant care. People were busy with attention. People who were busy didn't complain, organize, or notice that their landlord owned most of the heat and all of the firewood. Skirret messed up that rhythm. It quietly promised food without constant pain, which was a business model that was not acceptable. Skirret was enjoyed by even the most elite families. It showed up in the kitchens of the rich and was praised for its sweetness and usefulness. But when a food becomes popular with both peasants and elites, it makes things awkward because medieval society was all about keeping things separate. So, screw it. People started to think of it as old fashioned, rural, and simple, something you ate when you couldn't find anything else to eat, even though everyone knew it tasted good. This social demotion made it easier to leave skier without saying why. It worked too well. Over time, crops that needed more work, more fertilizer, and more centralized oversight took the place of skirret. Crops that failed in a big way, keeping people worried. Skirret didn't go away because it was weak. It went away because it was trustworthy. In medieval farming, dependability could be a danger in the wrong hands. Even though the name sounds like it, good King Henry was not named after a kind king. There is no crown, no castle, and no sad dynasty. People in the Middle Ages liked to call useful things good, but only right before someone else decided they were too much trouble, and King Henry was a big pain in the neck. This leafy green was happy growing near houses, along paths, next to manure piles, and in the kind of soil. That made other vegetables give up and think about their choices in life. It didn't need a field. It didn't need a plow. It didn't ask for permission. People, not property lines, were what good King Henry followed, which was already strange. Peasants thought of it as a reliable neighbor. Like spinach, the leaves were eaten. The shoots were cooked like asparagus. In times of need, the seeds could even be ground into flour. One plant can make many meals with little work. The best of medieval efficiency, and also its downfall. The problem is this: food was supposed to come from land that could be counted, taxed, and threatened. Good King Henry grew in small areas, edges, corners, and patches of ground that people had forgotten about, where power was weakest. You couldn't easily control it without also controlling life itself. It also did well year after year. Once it was set up, it came back on its own, providing food without the need for constant work, which was what medieval systems wanted. Labor made hierarchy make sense. A plant that. Reducing work was almost like rebelling. To make things worse, good King Henry was good for your health. It helped people feel a little better by calming their digestion, reducing inflammation, and making them feel better overall. People always thought plants that made life easier were suspicious. Comfort leads to confidence, and confidence has historically led to questions that are hard to answer. So, a full ban wasn't the answer. That would have taken work. Instead, good King Henry was slowly turned into a weed, something messy, something that wasn't cultured and that good people didn't grow on purpose. After being called unwanted, it quietly disappeared from managed gardens, even though it kept growing stubbornly wherever people tried to ignore it. It was replaced by newer crops over time, plants that needed careful planting, fertilizing, and watching over, crops that failed spectacularly if not cared for, crops that made people realize how much they depended on them. King Henry did not fail. It was thrown out, and like a lot of things from the Middle Ages, it didn't go away because it was bad. It went away because it was too good at making life bearable. Groundnut was a type of crop that made medieval leaders very nervous, mostly because it was too smart for its own good. Groundnut, on the other hand, chose to stay hidden, while respectable plants insisted on growing above ground where everyone could see them. It climbed up like a vine on the outside, but underground it quietly made tubers that were hidden, safe, and not anyone's business. Work. This plant did well in bad soil, survived a drought, and didn't mind pests at all. It didn't need any fertilizer. It didn't need to be watered. It didn't need to be watched all the time, so peasants could grow it, pick it, and eat it without asking for help or permission. A warning sign already. The tubers themselves had a lot of protein and calories, which is a bad mix if you want to keep people dependent. People panicked when there weren't enough grains. Ground nuts calmed people down. Less panic led to clear thinking, and calm thinking led to bad results in the past. Even worse, ground nuts stayed fresh. It could be picked in secret and stored underground until it was needed. This meant that inspections didn't always see it. Officials in the Middle Ages liked crops they could see. They felt in control when they could see things. Groundnut laughed softly under the ground. It didn't look impressive because the plant climbed instead of spreading out. There were no dramatic fields. There was a lot of food, but it was just a small vine doing its thing and secretly feeding families during hard times. Authorities often said it wasn't important, which only made it last longer, but that lack of visibility was also its downfall. It was hard to tax crops that were hard to count, and anything that got in the way of taxes eventually got a bad name. Groundnut was portrayed as unreliable, wild, or unsuitable for proper farming, even though it had been doing a great job for hundreds of years. It was eventually replaced by crops that were easier to keep an eye on and less likely to fail. Plants that made a lot of noise when things weren't going well. Crops that made peasants remember how easy it was for them to run out of food. Groundnut didn't go away because it was weak. It went away because it was quiet. And in the power systems of the Middle Ages, it was not okay to be secretive. Food should have been easy to see, measure, and get to. Groundnut provided sustenance without show. And that's how useful things have quietly disappeared throughout history. Sorrel was sharp, sour, and brutally honest, which was already a problem. The lemony taste cut through the endless diet of bread, porridge, and quiet despair that people in the Middle Ages ate. Your mouth woke up after one taste. Your stew got better, and for a moment, you remembered that food could do more than just keep you alive. Of course, this was scary. Sorrel grew all over the place, along roadsides, in fields, meadows, and at the edges of woods, if the ground. Sorrel thought it was a suggestion, not a requirement. If it existed, it did well in bad weather, survived frost, and came back year after year with the confidence of a plant that knew no one could stop it. Peasants in the Middle Ages loved it because it made bad food taste better and bad food taste better. It also did something much more dangerous. It made food that was going bad safer. The sourness of sorrel helped keep food fresh and cover up bad tastes. Sorrel helped when the meat was bad. Sorrel helped when the milk was going bad. When Sorrel helped because bread was old enough to have its own thoughts. This cut down on waste, illness, and the need for official food supplies, which was not the goal. Medieval medical texts said that sorrel could cool the body, lower fevers, and help with digestion. In other words, it helped people get better. Healthy peasants needed fewer medicines, fewer trips to holy sites, and fewer acts of charity. Institutions don't like it when they become less important. Sorrel grew wild, so peasants didn't need fields or permission to collect it, which was the real problem. Foraging was a gray area of medieval law. It was okay when people were really hungry, but it wasn't okay when order needed to be strengthened. A plant that fed people without rent or supervision made that gray area too big for comfort. So people started to know about sorrel. Too sharp, too sour, and too exciting, medieval doctors said that eating too much could throw off the humors, which was a very broad accusation that could be used against anything. Not easy. The story went that if peasants ate too much sorrel, they might get too excited or, even worse, have strong opinions. Over time, sorrel was quietly pushed to the edges. It wasn't completely banned. It was reworded to mean rustic, too much or medicinal, instead of food. You didn't use it very often, if at all. Something that goes with tough times, not everyday life. But sorrel never really went away. It stayed in the hedge, crept back into pots during bad years, and reminded people that flavor, resilience, and survival often grow together. Sorrel didn't go away because it was too hard. It disappeared because it made bad conditions easier to endure, and history has never been particularly fond of that. Carden looked like a plant that had lost an argument with civilization and decided to grow anyway. Tall, spiky, and aggressively uninviting. It resembled something you'd expect guarding a fortress rather than feeding a family, which ironically is exactly why it worked so well. Carden was related to the artichoke, but much tougher and not at all interested in being liked. It did well in bad soil, didn't mind drought and pests, and grew into huge plants that made edible stalks and leaves for months. There was no need to pamper it. It didn't need any fertilizer. It didn't even need a push. It just got bigger and took up space like it had been there for a long time. Peasants appreciated this. Carden provided food when other vegetables failed, especially in dry regions where respectable crops gave up immediately. It stored well, cooked well, and fed entire households with minimal labor. It was, in every sense, inconveniently effective. Authorities, however, saw something else. Chaos. Carden didn't grow neatly. It didn't respect boundaries. It didn't look like it was civilized. Medieval agriculture preferred plants that stayed in rows, behaved predictably, and visually reinforced the idea that humans were in control. Carden did none of that. It looked wild, even when intentionally cultivated, which made it very scary for anyone who cared about order. Another problem was its size. Big plants meant there was a lot of food, and when peasants had a lot of food, the elites were uneasy. A field of wheat could fail, which would remind people who owned the grain. No matter what the weather was like, a patch of carden kept feeding people, which was rude. There was also the issue of looks. People in the Middle Ages valued refinement, and Cardone was anything but that. It took planning, peeling, and patience, which peasants had a lot of. It was easier to say it was rough and unpleasant than to admit that it was true. So, Cardon slowly lost favor. It wasn't completely banned. It was ignored and replaced with crops that were easier to grow, easier to fail, and easier to control. Over time, Cardon changed from something common to something strange, exotic, or forgotten. Cardon, on the other hand, never cared what others thought. It kept growing wherever it could, with spines sticking out and wide leaves. It quietly reminded the world that strength doesn't need to be pretty. Cardon wasn't taken out because it was dangerous. It was taken away because it wasn't acting right. And history has always liked plants and people who follow the rules. Rampion was a plant that did well when people didn't expect much from it. Soil that is rocky, thin, and not cared for. Rampion didn't see these as problems. He saw them as ideas. Rampion quietly grew in places that medieval farmers had already given up on as useless, even though more delicate crops needed rich land and constant care. Of course, the peasants saw it. Rampion had edible roots and leaves, which made it seem too generous. One plant, two ways to get food, and little work. In medieval farming, people were surprised by people who were generous without working hard. Rampion didn't need any fertilizer. It didn't fall apart when the weather got bad. It just kept going, feeding people in areas where the government had little interest or control. The fact that they were independent was the real problem. Rampion let people live on land that wasn't closely watched, taxed, or even claimed. It loved the edges, both literal and political. When people could feed themselves on hillsides that had been forgotten, the whole system of controlled food production started to seem unnecessary. Rampion also needed patience instead of hard work all the time. You put it in the ground, waited, and then picked it when it was ready. This meant that peasants weren't always in fields where people could see them. Medieval systems put a lot of value on being seen. People might be thinking if they can't see them, and thinking historically can get you in trouble. The issue of symbolism was also present. Rampion became linked to rural independence and traditional culture. It was celebrated in songs, stories, and local foods. People were mildly worried about anything that encouraged people to identify with something other than a central authority. Cultural confidence opens the door to opinions that are hard to deal with. So, Rampion was redefined. It got rough and old-fashioned, and then it became useless. New crops promised better yields, but they also needed more care. Rampion was quietly put on the back burner, not because it failed, but because it didn't fit with the story of progress. After that, fairy tales would always have Rampion as a warning sign. If you eat Rampion, something will happen. A plant that fed the poor slowly turned into a lesson about knowing your place, very subtle and very useful. Rampion disappeared from fields and tables, and crops that needed better land, tools, and supervision took its place. Crops that made people think about who was in charge of survival. but rampion still grows in places that are no longer remembered, just like it always has. It waits, grows, and is not impressed. Rampion didn't go away because it was not strong. It went away because it made land that wasn't very useful important. And systems that depend on scarcity have always found that uncomfortable. Alexander's roots used to be everywhere, which is why almost no one remembers them now. Before carrots took over medieval kitchens and marched confidently into modern supermarkets, Alexander's roots did the same job, but with less fuss and more skill. This plant did well in bad soil, could handle the cold, and didn't need much care. Its roots were safe to eat. People could use its leaves, and it was annoying how it would grow anywhere. People didn't want to think too hard about farming. It worked, in other words. Alexander's roots were common in gardens at monasteries, village plots, and the edges of roads. They fed people reliably, without asking for a lot of work, which was another problem. Crops that don't need to be controlled as much make things less urgent, and control is based on urgency. Carrots, on the other hand, were much more dramatic. They needed better dirt, more attention, and better care. They responded very well to selective breeding, which made it possible for the authorities to standardize them, control seed stock, and measure yields. Alexander's roots didn't want to be a part of this vision. They didn't get dressed the same way. They didn't get better when told to. They just kept being useful. Of course, being useful without following orders was not acceptable. Branding also hurt Alexander's roots. They were old, familiar, and linked to the country. Then make progress. As carrots became popular, people said that Alexander's roots were old-fashioned and something your grandparents ate when things were bad. No need for a decree. Social pressure did the job quickly and quietly. Medical books still praised Alexander's roots for their ability to help with digestion and nutrition, but cooking styles changed, and once a food is no longer in style, it can be thrown away. History has a great track record of forgetting things that don't sell well. Alexander's roots changed over time, pushed aside by crops that looked brighter, cleaner, and easier to manage, crops that fit well into both rows, and plans for making money, crops that could fail loudly when systems needed them to follow the rules. Alexander's roots didn't die, they were replaced. In history, replacement is often a polite way of saying removal. Today, Alexander's roots mostly live on as footnotes, reminders that beauty doesn't always win out over strength, and that the strongest plants are often the first to be forgotten. Borage was the kind of plant that did a lot, but didn't ask for much in return. It healed wounds, made people feel better, attracted pollinators, made the soil better, and politely went away without needing to be watched. That level of cooperation was seen as suspicious in medieval farming. Borage grew quickly and happily in soil that wasn't very good. It didn't complain about the lack of rain. It didn't get cranky when it was cold. It made flowers and leaves that could be eaten and quietly helped nearby crops. Farmers saw that fields with borage seemed healthier, more productive, and strangely less dramatic, which was not what anyone wanted from medieval farming. Medical texts loved borage. People said it was good for the heart, the spirit, and courage. That's a strong statement, but medicine in the Middle Ages was always hopeful. Borage teas, picuses, and infusions made it less necessary to use expensive treatments, which made institutions a little uneasy again. What was the point of everyone else if people could heal themselves? Borage also drew in bees and good bugs, which naturally increases pollination. It did what modern farming tries to do with whole industries for free without anyone knowing. That kind of efficiency makes systems nervous. Then there was the cultural issue. Borage was linked to good mental health. People said it would make you happy and chase away sadness. Now, people in the Middle Ages were okay with being sad. Sadness was something I could handle, but happiness made people feel at ease. People who were relaxed asked questions. So borage was pushed gently aside. It wasn't completely banned. It was rephrased as optional, decorative, or medicinal, not necessary, but nice to have. It's easy to forget about a plant once it's labeled as non-essential. As farming moved toward crops that needed fertilizer, rotation, and constant care, borage quietly left the center of agriculture. It lived on in gardens, along the edges, and in people's memories, but not where it could really help. But borage never stopped doing what it does best. It still wants to grow. It still eats bugs. It still makes the soil better. It still reminds us that working with nature is possible and very hard for systems that are based on conflict. Borage didn't go away because it didn't work. It went away because it was too nice when it solved problems. And history doesn't often remember gentle solutions. Mallow was like that one neighbor who always seems to get through at every crisis with a calm smile and a pot of soup. Mallow, famine, mallow, illness, mallow, crop failure, and mallow. It grew everywhere, helped with almost everything, and asked for, which made it suspicious right away because it didn't ask for anything in return. Mallow did well in bad soil, along roadsides, near homes, and in empty lots where other crops wouldn't grow. You could eat its flowers, roots, and leaves. That was too much on its own. Medieval food systems liked specialization. One plant, one use, one tax group. Mallow didn't care about any of that and just fed people in a lot of different ways. It was also used as medicine, which never helped its reputation. Mallow helped with sore throats, upset stomachs, and inflammation. And in general, they made it so that people didn't have to go to official healers as often. A plant that took the place of both food and medicine, which blurred the lines that the authorities wanted to keep very clear. Mallow was even worse because he was kind. It made stews softer, broths thicker, and meals that would have been dull feel planned. Being comfortable is risky. People feel stable when they are comfortable. Stable people don't freak out when they should. Mallow was especially helpful during tough times, when there wasn't enough grain in the stores and the fields. Didn't work, mallow showed up anyway and quietly filled the gap. It made areas of land that had been forgotten into emergency kitchens. From an administrative point of view, this was a nightmare. Hunger was supposed to be a source of stress. Mallow took away the pressure. People thought mallow was a weed, a common, boring plant that wasn't worth paying attention to. It wasn't an accident. Saying that something is common is a great way to get rid of it without having to explain why. Medical writers kept saying good things about mallow quietly, but the official agriculture moved on to crops that needed more work, planning, and supervision. Crops that didn't do well when they were left alone. Crops that made people remember how fragile life was supposed to be. Of course, Mo was still there. It always does. It grows in the gaps, shows up when things are tough, and goes away again when systems get back in charge. It doesn't complain. It doesn't fight. It waits. Mallow didn't go away because it was weak. It went away because it was forgiving. And forgiving solutions often weaken systems that are very strict. Sea kale grew in areas that medieval farming didn't pay attention to. Wind-blasted coastlines, pebbled beaches, and salty soil that laughed at good crops. Wheat failed right away, and barley gave up out of spite. But sea kale stood strong, with thick leaves and deep roots, completely unfazed by conditions that would have sent other vegetables into an existential crisis. It didn't need any fertilizer. It could handle salt spray. It lived through storms, drought, and not paying attention. In other words, it didn't want to be a part of the drama that made farming manageable. Coastal communities depended a lot on sea kale. It brought fresh greens when crops in the inland areas failed, and it came back every year without fail. You didn't plow for it. You didn't switch fields. You didn't beg the weather. You harvested and moved on with your life, which was exactly what was wrong. Sea kale completely skipped the food chain in the middle of the country. It grew outside of managed farmland, where it was hard to tax. More than just regular oversight, lords were in charge of fields. They were in charge of barns. They were in charge of grain. They didn't have control over the beaches, and anything that fed people outside of official systems was seen as suspiciously helpful. There was also the issue of strength and storage. It was hard to eat sea kale. Its thick leaves kept pests and rot away. Its roots held it down so well that storms often couldn't pull it up. This kind of resilience went against the medieval idea that nature needed to be controlled all the time. Sea kale didn't want to be in charge. It needed space. The government never made it illegal. That would have meant admitting how valuable it was. Instead, it was described as wild, rough, and not as good as real vegetables. People who lived by the coast ate this because they didn't have any other choices. This story worked well and quietly. As agriculture in the interior grew and trade networks grew, sea kale was replaced by vegetables that were easier to standardize, move, and sell. Crops that needed infrastructure and crops that died when systems broke down. Sea kale only wanted to be left alone. It slowly moved back to the edges. Dunes, cliffs, and shores that have been forgotten. Still growing, still safe to eat, and still doing what it always did. It didn't go away. People just ignored it until it went away. Sea kale didn't go away because it was weak. It went away because it grew where people in charge couldn't go. And history has always had trouble with things that grow outside of its reach. Asparagus pear had an identity that was very hard to understand, which didn't help it stay alive for a long time. It wasn't asparagus. It wasn't really a pea. It tasted a little bit like asparagus when it was young, made edible pods later, and usually didn't want to commit to a single role. Medieval farming liked things to be clear. Everyone was worried about asparagus pea because it could be used in so many ways. This plant did well in bad soil, could handle heat, fought off pests, and didn't need much care. It grew happily where other vegetables didn't, and it made edible shoots and pods for a long time. In other words, it did a lot more, asking for too much and getting too little. Asparagus pea was valuable to peasants because it filled in gaps. It didn't fail when one crop did. It helped when food stores got smaller. It politely went on without complaint when there wasn't enough labor. But systems that are based on control, like things to be predictable, not flexible, asparagus PA also kept well and could be picked in stages. That meant that food wasn't only available at one big moment. No panic, no sudden rise in prices, just steady food supply, which managers historically find disturbing. Even worse, asparagus pea didn't need a lot of tilling or strict planting schedules. It didn't fit well into rotational farming systems that were made to work with crops that are mostly grains. Anything that takes away from the importance of grain is immediately suspect. As time went on, asparagus pea was slowly replaced by crops that needed more care but gave more in return. Crops that needed better soil, tools, and timing. Crops that reminded farmers of how fragile their survival was. People started to think of asparagus pea as strange, old-fashioned, or just not needed. It wasn't in style. It didn't work well on a larger scale. It didn't photograph nicely for medieval cookbooks, a tragically overlooked market. But in its quiet way, asparagus pea had been doing something remarkable, smoothing out food supply shocks, making hunger less dramatic, reducing reliance on centralized stores. And history, as we've seen, prefers hunger dramatic. Asparagus pea didn't disappear because it failed. It disappeared because it refused to be essential in only one way. Versatility is powerful, and power that cannot be neatly categorized rarely lasts. Chickweed suffered from the worst breeding problem in agricultural history. Its name. If you call something a weed long enough, people stop asking whether it might actually be food. And chickweed was very much food, nutritious, abundant, and irritatingly reliable, which made the name extremely convenient for everyone in charge. Chickweed grew everywhere, not figuratively, literally everywhere. Fields, gardens, roadsides, cracks in walls, abandoned lots, places no one had officially approved for life. It sprouted quickly, spread generously, and stayed tender and edible for most of the year. While other vegetables demanded planning, chickweed simply showed up like a friend who brings snacks without being asked. Nutritionally, chickweed was embarrassing. It contained vitamins, minerals, and enough nourishment to matter, especially during early spring. when stored food was running low and hope was a limited resource. It filled the seasonal hunger gap quietly, without ceremony and without paperwork, which of course was the problem. Chickweed didn't belong to anyone. It didn't require fields, fences, or tools. It grew in places where there wasn't much authority and not much oversight. Peasants could pick it up for free, so they could eat without having to buy, borrow, or beg for food. A food that made people less desperate was a danger to systems that depended on it. So, people said chickweed was useless and threw it away. Something chickens ate, something poor people ate when things were bad. The implication was clear. Respectable people ignored it. Respectable people, historically, are very easy to manipulate. Medical texts quietly acknowledged chickweed's benefits. Healers used it. Villagers knew its value. But official agriculture had no interest in promoting a plant that solved problems without creating dependency. As farming shifted toward crops that required seed control, fertilization, and oversight, chickweed became an inconvenience. You couldn't stop it from growing, but you could stop talking about it. And once something stops being talked about, it effectively disappears. But chickweed never actually left. It kept growing. It kept feeding. It kept thriving in the margins. Even today, it pops up uninvited, reminding us that food doesn't always need permission, and resilience doesn't require innovation, just patience and neglect. Chickweed wasn't removed because it was weak. It was ignored because it was unstoppable. And history, when faced with things it cannot control, prefers to look away. Medieval convents were supposed to be fortresses against desire, high walls, locked gates, barred windows, and a timetable so strict it left little room for thinking, let alone sin. On parchment, it all looked wonderfully airtight. Bishops loved to imagine convents as perfectly sealed jars of holiness, where women floated through life on prayer, silence, and thin soup. Reality, unfortunately, had a habit of picking the lock. Most nuns did not arrive because they felt an overwhelming spiritual calling. Many were placed there by families making cold, practical decisions. Noble households sent spare daughters to convents to avoid splitting estates. Merchant families saw convents as cheaper than dowries. Peasant girls were sometimes offered up simply because there was not enough food to go around. Once the door closed behind them, these women were expected to live out a vow they had barely chosen for decades until death politely intervened. Life inside a convent was repetitive to the point of madness. The same prayers, the same corridors, the same faces day after day, year after year. Silence was enforced, but silence does not erase emotion. It amplifies it. Affection, jealousy, boredom, loneliness, and curiosity had nowhere to go. They did not vanish, they pulled, and eventually they found cracks. Convents were also not as isolated as church authorities like to claim. Confessors came and went. Priests heard sins in private rooms. Male workers fixed roofs, dug gardens, and brought supplies. People brought letters in and out. Some convents were right in the middle of towns, next to regular houses. Some people used secret doors, back hallways, or poorly guarded gates to run errands. It's a comforting fantasy, not a historical fact, that no man has ever crossed into this world. The church was aware of this. There are a lot of warnings in church records that sound like someone trying to plug a hole with their fingers. With their fingers, a dam that is leaking. People usually ignore rules when they start to pile up, and they weren't always dramatic or scandalous, but they were often enough to make bishops worry, and they knew one thing very well. A vow made without choice is a weak thing. This conflict between what God wanted and what people actually did set the stage for everything that came after. There were no forbidden relationships, because convents were places where people did bad things. They happened because convents were places where people lived based on an ideal that didn't think about how hard it is to resist desire when it's behind stone walls. When there wasn't much contact with the outside world, emotions tended to fold back on themselves. Medieval convents were mostly for women. They ate, worked, and slept together, and they lived their lives together with very little time apart. There was no way to avoid being close. The church promoted spiritual sisterhood, yet seldom delineated the boundaries between spiritual intimacy and other forms of connection. Nuns' friendships could be very strong. Letters and convent rules talk about certain friendships, which is what church leaders said when they were worried. These weren't just casual ties. Some pairs insisted on sitting, working, and praying together, and they got upset when they were apart. Abbesses were told to break up these kinds of relationships, not because they were bad for discipline, but because they thought they would lead the heart astray. It was hard for church writers to talk about what they were afraid of without saying it out loud. They told them not to touch each other too much, share beds, talk quietly after lights out, or give each other gifts in secret. There is a reason for these warnings. When rules are repeated, behavior is usually not made up. In convents, where warmth and affection were hard to come by, emotional hunger found willing partners. Not all closeness was sexual, but people in the Middle Ages often thought it could become sexual. Emotional ties were dangerous because they seemed safe at first. Comfort during sickness became a need. Shared sadness became exclusive. In a world where romantic attachment was completely rejected, even minor gestures could have significant impact. Holding hands for too long, using a private nickname, or giving someone a look that only two people could understand could all feel like rebellion. There were a lot of different kinds of punishments. Some Abbessones chose to be discreet and quietly separated the women, giving them different tasks. Others made people fast, be alone, or do penance in public. A few cases got worse and went to church. Courts, where records use careful, vague language that doesn't give too much away, but makes the point clear enough. The church liked correction better than spectacle, especially when there were no men around and the scandal could be kept inside. The most interesting thing about these relationships is not that they are rare, but that they are predictable. Take away men, make marriage illegal, make people stay quiet, and make them stay celibate for life, and love will not die. It changes. Medieval convents did not eradicate want. They turned it inward, making ties that were so strong that the church was worried they might compete with devotion to God. Paper slipped through stone walls even more easily than stone walls. Letters were the quiet lifeblood of convent life in the Middle Ages. They were officially allowed and carefully controlled, but they were also abused all the time. Nuns could write to family, patrons, and church officials, but they needed permission, supervision, and, if possible, complete innocence. What the rules said was okay, and what really happened and what happened were two very different things. At first, some letters didn't seem too bad. Polite greetings, health updates, and promises of prayers in exchange for donations. But writers learn how to hide meaning in polite language. Phrases about wanting spiritual help, being thankful for past kindness, or being worried about a friend could easily be used as emotional confessions. In the Middle Ages, people learned how to write indirectly, and nuns were especially good at it. When passion could not be, it learned to whisper when it was named. Letters from survivors show language that feels too personal. Writers wrote about how their hearts hurt, how they couldn't sleep at night, and how happy they were to think about being together again. Some promised to remember forever. Others begged for answers with a sense of urgency that went far beyond polite letters. The church officials saw it. Bishops said that letters from convents sounded more like love poems than spiritual reflections, and they told confessors to keep a close eye on them. It was not hard to smuggle letters most of the time. Messengers, servants, priests who came to visit, and even family members who were sympathetic acted as couriers. Some letters were hidden in baskets of food or sewn into clothes. Some convents set up informal networks where people they trusted made sure that messages got to the right people in both directions. It often got worse once writing started. Letters asked for answers. Responses led to meetings, and meetings changed rumors into risks. When found, letters were dangerous proof, not like. They could be read out loud, copied, and kept, even if they were just quick glances or whispered words. Abbesses were told to take away any letters that looked suspicious and tell their bosses about them. Some letters were burned right away to keep the scandal from spreading. Some people lived because they were taken and kept as proof of wrongdoing. Ironically, the very effort to get rid of them helped them stay alive. The punishments were different again. Writers may be confined, compelled to silence, or relocated to more stringent facilities. In serious cases, whole convents were suspected, which led to inspections and changes. Letters showed not only personal desire, but also the weakness of institutions. They showed that enclosure was never complete, and that emotional ties could go far beyond the walls that were supposed to keep them in. These letters remind us that nuns in the Middle Ages weren't just quiet people who prayed all the time. They were smart, well-spoken women who made the most of what they had. Ink became their quiet rebellion, carrying forbidden love where feet couldn't go. Letters that slipped quietly through convent walls were fine, but confessors walked right through the front door with the church's full approval. Convent life depended on priests. They heard confessions, said Mass, preached, and gave spiritual advice. They were supposed to be neutral tools of God. In reality, they were men who had been trained to obey women and had a lot of emotional power over them. Confession was supposed to cleanse the soul, but it also brought people closer together. A nun would often talk to a man behind a screen, telling him her fears, doubts, and temptations. He was sworn to keep her secret. Some confessors became more than just spiritual guides over time. They became confident, emotional anchors, and in some cases, things that people loved. Writers from the church warned many times that private confession made people too familiar with each other, especially if it happened too often or without supervision. The threat went both ways. Some priests took advantage of their power, turning devotion into dependence. They said that love was a form of spiritual guidance, or that strong connections were signs of God's favor. Some people convinced nuns that following their orders was the same as following God's orders. Medieval church records use phrases like too much familiarity and inappropriate consolation that make people uncomfortable. These phrases were carefully chosen so that they wouldn't say what everyone already knew. Not all cases involved coercion. Some relationships grew slowly, shaped by shared beliefs, conversations, and being emotionally weak. A confessor who listened, encouraged, and praised could be like a lifeline in a world that seemed closed off. For a priest, being admired by a smart, interested audience may have been just as intoxicating. When the lines between the two sides got blurry, both sides were in danger of losing everything. The church's rules looked like they were trying to fix things. There were a lot of different confessors. Some convents required that two nuns be present for spiritual talks. Some people said that priests could only visit a certain number of times, or that they couldn't meet with people in private at all. These steps weren't just ideas, they were responses to scandals that kept happening. When relationships were found out, the results were bad. Priests could lose their jobs, be sent to a different monastery, or even go to jail. Nuns could be punished by being sent to harsher houses, put in solitary confinement, or forced to do penance. In the worst cases, whole convents were accused of being corrupt, which led to inspections that turned spiritual homes into crime scenes. What made these relationships especially bad for church leaders was not only sexual misconduct, but also the breakdown of hierarchy. A confessor who crossed lines put the very structure of obedience that convent life depended on in danger. The church never wanted to admit how easy it was to cross the line between guidance and control. Church leaders could handle rumors of love. People could burn letters, end friendships, and move priests to different places. But it was much harder to explain away children. But records from the Middle Ages make it painfully clear that pregnancies did happen inside. Walls of the convent. Not common, but very dangerous when found. A pregnant nun was proof that enclosure had failed beyond a doubt. Not only did they want to know how it happened, but they also wanted to know how many people knew. Hiding things required teamwork. Other nuns, servants, midwives, and even abbesses sometimes became silent participants. Lax habits, limited movement, and claims of being sick bought time. In some cases, childbirth happened in secrecy at night, with trusted helpers sworn to silence. What happened to the children's lives depended completely on their circumstances. Some babies were quietly sent away to live with relatives, families who were willing to take them in, or left at foundling hospitals. Some people completely disappeared from the record, leaving historians to guess what happened that was never written down. A few convents developed disturbingly efficient systems for removing evidence before it could reach church authorities. When pregnancies were exposed, punishment could be brutal. Nuns were questioned, sometimes under a lot of pressure to name accomplices. If fathers were found, they would have to face their own punishments, but records show that women felt more shame. Some nuns were expelled and forced into public penance. Others were locked into stricter convents, their lives reduced to silence and isolation. In extreme cases, ecclesiastical courts imposed lifelong imprisonment. The church publicly framed these cases as moral collapse, but the responses reveal something more complicated. Authorities were often reluctant to expose scandal fully. Bishops weighed punishment against reputation, choosing secrecy when public outrage threatened donations or political support. Quiet resolutions were preferred. Justice was negotiable. Appearances were not. These hidden children exposed the contradiction at the heart of medieval convent life. Celibacy was demanded, but choice was often absent. Surveillance was strict, but never absolute. Women were blamed, yet systems quietly adjusted to protect institutions rather than individuals. The convent did not simply fail these women. It absorbed their mistakes and erased them behind stone walls built to separate holiness from flesh. Life continued to assert itself. Crying infants, hastily arranged removals, and rewritten records all testify to a truth the church struggled to control. Vows could be enforced, but biology and emotion were far less obedient. Medieval convents were described as sealed spaces, but archaeology and records tell a more inconvenient story. Enclosure looked great from the outside, but it needed people to be disciplined than being physically impossible. And, being human, they made holes in stone. Many convents had extra doors that were meant to be used for practical purposes. Food deliveries, waste removal, repairs, and medical emergencies required access points beyond the main gate. Over time, these doors became routine, then invisible, then quietly exploited. A back door used once a week became a door no one questioned. A key held for emergencies became a key held permanently. Perfect enclosure existed mostly in sermons. Some convents shared walls with surrounding towns. Windows opened onto streets, roofs connected to neighboring buildings. In a few documented cases, passages and tunnels existed beneath convents, originally built for drainage, storage, or escape during sieges. Later, rumor claimed they served more interesting purposes. While not every tale of secret tunnels is true, enough physical evidence survives to confirm that some convents were far more porous than their rules suggested. Servants played a crucial role. Unlike nuns, They were not cloistered for life. They moved between convent and town, carrying messages, supplies, and gossip. Trust in servants was necessary, but trust created an opportunity. A discreet servant could arrange meetings, pass letters, or simply look the other way. Silence had a price, and medieval society was very good at informal transactions. Abbesses were often aware of these weaknesses. Some fought relentlessly to enforce discipline, sealing doors, rotating staff, and reporting suspicions upward. Others picked pragmatism. They knew that rigid enforcement could provoke rebellion or attract unwanted scrutiny. A controlled leak was sometimes preferable to an explosion. As long as scandals remained quiet, order was considered intact. When church inspectors arrived, convents transformed. Suspicious doors were bricked up temporarily. Routines were tightened. Nuns were coached on what to say and what to forget. Inspections were announced in advance more often than not, giving communities time to prepare. This was not corruption so much as institutional survival. The myth of perfect enclosure mattered because it protected authority. If convent walls were truly impenetrable, then any scandal could be blamed on individual sin. If they admitted that there were structural problems, they would have to admit that the system itself was not realistic. The church held on to the idea of sealed holiness, even though doors were quietly opening and closing behind it. Stone walls can stop people from walking. They can't stop intention. Medieval convents were not breached by dramatic escapes or daring lovers, but by small compromises repeated until enclosure became an idea rather than a reality. When forbidden relationships came to light, the church faced a dilemma. Public punishment reinforced moral authority, but public scandal damaged reputations, donations, and political ties. The solution was often selective justice, harsh enough to deter, quiet enough to contain. Medieval discipline was less about fairness and more about control. Minor infractions were usually handled internally. A non-accused of inappropriate closeness might be reassigned, isolated, or subjected to fasting and extra prayers. Silence was a favored tool. Being forbidden to speak, sing, or participate in communal life could last months or years. In a world built on shared ritual, silence was not mild punishment. It was erasure. More serious cases triggered ecclesiastical courts. These proceedings were deliberately opaque. Records use vague language like grave misconduct or violation of chastity, avoiding explicit detail. The goal was not truth for its own sake, but the restoration of order. Confessions were extracted, penance assigned, and documentation sealed away. Justice happened behind closed doors, just like the offenses themselves. Status mattered enormously. A well-connected convent with noble patrons often received gentler treatment than a poor rural house. Influential families could intervene, requesting transfers instead of expulsions. Abbesses from powerful lineages negotiated directly with bishops. Meanwhile, lower status nuns faced harsher outcomes, sometimes becoming convenient examples of moral decay. Men, when involved, were punished differently. Priests might be reassigned, quietly disciplined, or sent to another monastery. Public disgrace was rare unless the scandal had already escaped containment. Women bore the visible consequences. Their bodies provided evidence. Their reputations were easier to sacrifice. The imbalance was neither accidental nor hidden, or silence extended beyond punishment. People who saw what happened were discouraged not to speak. The letters were thrown away, children were removed, memories were managed. The goal was not only to stop behavior, but to eliminate narrative. A scandal forgotten was a scandal resolved. Ironically, this culture of silence made repetition more likely. Without open acknowledgement, patterns went unexamined. Reforms addressed symptoms rather than causes. Rules multiplied. Surveillance increased. Yet, the underlying pressures remained unchanged. Punishment in medieval convents was more about upkeep than morality. The church did not need perfect purity. It needed plausible purity. As long as walls appeared intact and voices stayed quiet, the system could continue. Those who broke that silence paid the price, not for what they did alone, but for what their exposure threatened to reveal. Every major scandal sparked reform. New rules were written, inspections intensified, and sermons thundered about discipline and decay. From the outside, it looked like decisive action. From inside the convents, it felt like déjà vu. Reform did not remove desire, it merely forced it to adapt. The church repeatedly tightened enclosure. Grills were reinforced, windows were screened, visiting hours were shortened, confessors were rotated more frequently. Yet each reform revealed the same uncomfortable truth. The system depended on constant vigilance, and constant vigilance eventually failed. Human fatigue proved more reliable than divine regulation. Some convents collapsed entirely under scandal when accusations multiplied or evidence became impossible to bury. Houses were dissolved. Nuns were sent to other places, and their community was erased as if it had never existed. Official explanations never mentioned structural failure, only corruption or spiritual weakness. Blame stayed safely individual. Other scandals became well known. There were ballads, rumors, and funny stories going around about nuns who were in love, secret lovers, and meetings at midnight. These stories often made things sound worse than they were, but they were important because they kept coming up. They reflected widespread awareness that convents were not the sealed sanctuaries the church claimed. The public knew, the clergy knew, the public knew. Everyone pretended otherwise. Ironically, these stories hardened expectations. Nuns were increasingly viewed with suspicion, and stricter rules were justified by the assumption that temptation was everywhere. Women paid the price for reputations they did not individually earn. Innocence became irrelevant. Surveillance replaced trust. Reformers within the church occasionally recognized more serious issues. Some people said that forced vocations were the main cause. Some people questioned the lifelong vows that teenagers had to make. These voices didn't win very often. Convents were still useful for managing family politics, inheritance, and social order. The institution stayed around because it was useful, not because it was kind. By the end of the Middle Ages, it was impossible to ignore the cracks. Calls for change went beyond the walls of the convent, adding to bigger criticisms of church authority. When the Reformation came, convent. People were quick to use scandals as proof of systemic hypocrisy. Stories that were once whispered became public weapons. Reform failed because it looked at behavior without looking at consent. It treated desire as a choice instead of something that had to happen. Medieval convents were not the only places that were corrupt. They were pressure chambers built to keep people from getting what they needed without letting them go. Scandal didn't destroy convents right away, but it did make the illusion that held them together weaker, and once that illusion broke, it never fully got better. By the end of the Middle Ages, it was impossible to completely hide the story of forbidden relationships in convents. Not because every convent was bad, but because the difference between what was ideal and what was real was finally too clear. Even though hundreds of years of evidence said otherwise, the church kept saying that enclosure worked in theory. The walls stayed, the illusion didn't. The records show humanity more clearly than scandal. Nuns in the Middle Ages were not symbols. They were women who didn't have many options and were forced to make lifelong vows, often before they really understood what they meant. Some changed their minds with real faith. Others had a hard time without saying anything. Some people looked for connection wherever they could find it. By today's standards, what they did wasn't unusual or shocking. The system around them made them dangerous. The church saw forbidden relationships as moral failure, but history shows that they were caused by structural strain. Convents brought together young people, took away their choices, kept them from being sexual, made them stay quiet, and demanded perfection. When cracks showed up, people pointed fingers at each other. Institutions stayed alive by making people feel guilty and then leaving them out of the story. The attempt to hide these stories, ironically, made sure they would live on. Court records, reformed decrees, confiscated letters, and disciplinary manuals kept what sermons tried to deny. Historians do not discover these relationships inadvertently. The church wrote down everything about them over and over again, trying to control what it couldn't stop. These stories also explain why medieval society was both interested in and afraid of convents. They stood for purity when things got tough, and holiness when people were watching. When they failed, even quietly, it unsettled the broader belief that strict rules could remake human nature. The problem was never desire alone, the belief that desire could be permanently contained. In later centuries, reforms made some extremes less harsh. Enforced vocations diminished. Education and choice slowly increased. But the medieval experiment left its mark. It revealed the cost of treating obedience as virtue without consent and silence as proof of holiness. The walls of medieval convents were real. The vows were real. The expectations were real. What was never real was the idea that human connection could be eliminated by stone and rules. Behind every locked gate lived people negotiating faith, fear, affection, and survival. Forbidden relationships were not the story of convicts, they were the symptom. The real story is what happens when institutions demand perfection from humans, then punish them for being exactly what they are. In a medieval convent, a vow was not a personal spiritual commitment. It was a public contract spoken aloud, witnessed by church officials, recorded by scribes, and enforced by an institution that understood vows as structural pillars. When a nun broke one, especially chastity, obedience, or enclosure, it was not treated as a moment of weakness. It was treated as a threat. Convents survived on reputation, donations, protection from local lords, and favor. From bishops depended on the belief that these were sealed spaces of discipline and purity. One broken vow suggested that the walls were not working, that the rules were failing, and that authority was slipping. This is why punishment was rarely quiet or gentle. Discipline was designed not just to correct the individual, but to reassure everyone else that control still existed. Unlike secular law, convent discipline operated without juries, lawyers, or appeals. Abbesses had wide authority. Bishops had more. Accusations did not require proof beyond suspicion, rumor, or confession extracted under pressure. Once guilt was assumed, punishment followed quickly. The goal was speed, containment, and example. Even minor offenses could escalate. Excessive laughter, private conversations, refusal to obey orders, or emotional attachment could all be interpreted as early signs of moral decay. The logic was preventative. Better to punish early than allow corruption to spread. A nun did not need to commit a scandal to be disciplined. She only needed to make superiors nervous. What made convent punishment particularly severe was its permanence. Punishments that weren't religious ended. People paid their fines. Prison terms expired, but convent discipline often reshaped an entire life. A woman punished inside the church rarely returned to normal standing. Her reputation within the convent was marked. Her movements were restricted. Her future was narrowed. The church framed this system as spiritual medicine. Pain was meant to heal the soul. Fear was meant to protect holiness. But the structure reveals another function entirely. Punishment was a tool of maintenance. It preserved hierarchy, silence, and obedience in an environment where consent was often absent. To break a vow was to expose a crack in the system. Punishment existed to seal that crack quickly, even if it meant crushing the person who revealed it. In medieval convents, discipline was not about forgiveness. It was about control, and control was considered sacred. When convent authorities wanted to break a nun without drawing public attention, they turned to isolation. Solitary confinement was one of the most effective and commonly used punishments precisely because it left no visible marks. A nun could be removed from communal life and effectively erased while still remaining physically inside the convent. Isolation cells varied widely, but few were humane. Some were small rooms at the edge of the convent, others repurposed storage spaces, and some were little more than stone closets. Light was limited. Heat was unreliable. In colder regions, winter confinement could be physically dangerous. A straw mattress, a wooden stool, and a prayer book were often all that remained. Silence was strictly enforced. The punished nun was forbidden to speak except in prayer, and sometimes not even then. Meals were passed through doors or left on the floor. Confession, if allowed, was brief and controlled. Human contact was minimized to the point where days blended into one another. This was not accidental. Medieval discipline understood silence as both penance and pressure. The church describes solitude as spiritually cleansing. Alone with God, the sinner was meant to reflect, repent, and reform. In practice, the effect was often psychological collapse. Nuns accustomed to structured routine and communal worship suddenly faced emptiness. The mind, deprived of stimulation, turned it inward. Anxiety, despair, and hallucinations were not uncommon, though rarely recorded as such. Isolation also served a symbolic function. Removing a nun from communal spaces signaled disgrace. Her absence was noticed. Others were reminded that punishment was real, even if details remained unspoken. Silence created mystery, and mystery amplified fear. Duration was flexible. Some confinements lasted weeks, others stretched into months or years. Release depended on perceived obedience, confession, or the judgment of superiors. There was no clear standard. The uncertainty itself became part of the punishment. In contrast to secular imprisonment, solitary confinement in convents lacked external oversight. No one looked at the conditions, no one checked for damage. The abbess's authority was absolute within the walls. A punishment framed as spiritual guidance became an instrument of total control. Isolation did not correct behavior so much as erase resistance. When a nun returned to communal life, she did so subdued, cautious, and acutely aware of her vulnerability. Silence had done its work. When silence alone was not enough, hunger followed. Food restriction was one of the most visible and humiliating punishments. Available in medieval convents, it required no chains, no cells, and no witnesses beyond the dining hall itself. A nun placed on a bread and water diet carried her punishment on her body. This diet was exactly what it sounds like. Dry bread, often coarse and stale, and water, sometimes rationed, no vegetables, no broth, no wine. The punishment could last days, weeks, or far longer, depending on the perceived severity of the offense. In a time when daily meals were already sparse, this reduction pushed the body quickly toward weakness. The purpose was not starvation in the modern sense, it was submission. Hunger sharpened obedience. A hungry nun lacked the strength to resist, argue, or defy authority. The church framed the diet as imitation of Christ's suffering and a reminder of humility. In reality, it functioned as physical pressure disguised as spiritual exercise. The punishment was often public. While other nuns ate their meals, the punished sister sat apart or received her bread in silence. No one needed an explanation. Everyone understood. Shame did the rest of the work. Hunger isolated just as effectively as confinement. But without removing the body from view, health consequences were common, especially for younger nuns or those already weakened by illness. Fainting, dizziness, and prolonged weakness were quietly accepted risks. Complaints were interpreted as resistance rather than distress. A body that failed was seen as evidence of guilt, not suffering. Bread and water diets were also used strategically. They could precede confession, accompany interrogation, or follow suspected misconduct even without proof. Hunger softened resolve. It encouraged repentance that might otherwise remain withheld. In this sense, the diet became a tool of extraction as much as punishment. Unlike secular fasting, convent hunger was compulsory. Refusal only escalated discipline. There was no negotiation, and none could not appeal to family, law, or community. Her body belonged to the rule. By controlling food, convent authorities controlled time, energy, and will. Hunger blurred thought, narrowed focus, and reduced identity to obedience. In medieval convents, discipline did not need violence to be brutal. It only needed patience, bread, and water. When church authorities wanted punishment to be seen, they turned to public penance. Unlike solitary confinement or hunger, this form of discipline relied on visibility. Shame was not a side effect, it was the point. A nun sentenced to public penance was required to perform acts of submission in front of her community. She might kneel during services while others stood, lie prostrate on the stone floor, or confess her fault aloud in vague but unmistakable terms. Sometimes she wore special clothing, a coarse habit, no veil or a marker of disgrace that separated her visually from the rest of the convent. These rituals were carefully choreographed. They followed a familiar structure of accusation, submission, and conditional forgiveness. The community watched in silence. No comfort was offered. Compassion risked being interpreted as defiance. The message was clear. Obedience was restored through humiliation. Public penance reinforced hierarchy. The abbess or superior occupied a position of authority. Dispensing mercy after submission was demonstrated. Forgiveness was granted from above, not negotiated, even when a nun had already suffered confinement or hunger. Public penance served as a final confirmation that she had been broken and reintegrated under control. The effects on the mind lasted. Reputation in a convent mattered deeply. Communal life depended on trust, cooperation, and shared ritual. Public humiliation fractured that trust. A punished nun carried her disgrace long after the ritual ended. Glances lingered. Conversation stopped when she approached. Silence followed her through corridors. In theory, public penance was meant to cleanse both sinner and community. In practice, it often reinforced fear. Witnessing punishment reminded every nun that her safety depended on compliance. Even innocent behavior became cautious. Affection was restrained. Speech was measured. The system policed itself through memory. Public penance was also selective. Well-connected convents sometimes minimized it to avoid scandal. Powerful families negotiated discretion. Poorer nuns lacking protection were more likely to be made examples of. Justice followed status. By turning discipline into ritual, the church transformed punishment into theater. The body became the stage, shame the lesson, and silence the applause. In medieval convents, Public penance did not just correct behavior, it taught everyone watching exactly how fragile their place truly was. When convent authorities decided that a nun could no longer be trusted, but also could not be released, they imposed one of the harshest penalties available: permanent enclosure. This punishment did not involve chains or public spectacle. It was quieter, colder, and far more final. Permanent enclosure meant that a nun remained inside the convent for life, deprived of liberties and privileges within the very place that was supposed to be safe. This kind of enclosure was even more limiting than normal cloistered life, even for monks. Movement was limited. Participation in communal activities was reduced or denied. Contact with others was tightly controlled. Some women were confined to specific wings of the convent, forbidden to enter the choir, refectory, or garden at the same time as others. They prayed alone. They ate alone. They worked alone. The convent remained around them, but they were no longer part of it. This was not being sent away. It was containment. It was easy to understand why permanent enclosure was a good idea. It would have been a scandal to kick a nun out. Releasing her into the secular world raised questions. Keeping her inside, out of sight, and under control fixed both problems. The institution remained intact. The transgression disappeared from view for the punished nun. The effect was devastating. There was no end date, no promise of restoration. Unlike temporary penance, permanent enclosure offered no narrative of redemption. It assumed failure was irreversible, life narrowed to routine without community, faith without fellowship. This punishment was especially common in cases involving repeated disobedience, sexual misconduct, or accusations that threatened convent reputation. Whether guilt was proven mattered less than risk. A woman perceived as unstable, defiant, or dangerous to order could be quietly removed from view forever. Church records rarely described the emotional impact. They did not need to. Permanent enclosure did what? Above all else, discipline wanted silence. The woman who was punished stopped being a problem when she stopped being seen. Permanent enclosure had no legal challenge, no appeal, and no oversight, unlike secular imprisonment. Once imposed, it was nearly impossible to reverse. A nun could live decades under this sentence, aging behind the same walls that once promised protection. In medieval convents, permanent enclosure was not correction. It was erasure, a life reduced to compliance, not through violence, but through isolation so complete that resistance simply ran out. Expulsion was the punishment reserved for cases the church could no longer contain quietly. Unlike enclosure, which hid failure, expulsion exposed it. To be cast out of a convent was not simply a loss of home. It was a social death sentence. A nun expelled from her house lost protection, identity, and status in a single moment. She was stripped of her habit, sometimes publicly, sometimes behind closed doors, but always symbolically. The habit marked belonging. Without it, she became something dangerous. A woman trained for religious life, with no place in the secular world. For many women, expulsion was catastrophic. Families who sent their daughters to convents often did so because they couldn't afford to take care of them or didn't want them back. The dowries were gone. Marriages were impossible. An expelled nun returned to society carrying suspicion, stigma, and few practical skills beyond prayer, reading, and domestic labor. Survival depended on charity or the mercy of relatives who may have already written her off. The church did not expel lightly. Scandal had to outweigh risk. Sexual misconduct made public. Repeated disobedience or refusal to submit to discipline could push authorities to this extreme. Sometimes expulsion followed failed attempts at confinement or penance. Sometimes it was immediate, decisive, and unforgiving. Ironically, kicking people out was also a way to protect institutions. Taking away a nun who was causing problems put the blame on the person. The convent remained pure. The system remained sound. The expelled woman became the story, not the structure that shaped her. Some expelled nuns disappeared into poverty. Others entered informal religious communities or attached themselves to hospitals, begonages, or households willing to overlook their past. A few reinvented themselves entirely, but the record is mostly silent. Expulsion erased people from history as effectively as enclosure erased them from sight. Unlike secular punishment, there was no path back, no rehabilitation, no restoration of status. Once expelled, a woman existed outside both church and society, belonging fully to neither. Expulsion showed how far medieval mercy could go. When discipline failed, compassion came to an end. The convent shut down, and with it, the obligation to the life it had helped shape. In medieval convents, expulsion was more than just a punishment. It was abandonment, blessed by authority and sealed by silence. When promises were broken, punishment was not always fair. The church talked a lot about sin, but discipline followed hierarchy, and in that hierarchy, nuns almost always paid more than the men involved. If a relationship involved a priest, confessor, or cleric, consequences diverged sharply. Men were often reassigned, quietly transferred to another parish or monastery, or subjected to mild penance that left their careers intact. Their authority was framed as compromised, not their character. A change of location solved the problem. Silence finished the job. Nuns had no such escape. Their bodies were evidence. Pregnancy, reputation, and confinement made their guilt visible in ways male transgressions never were. Even when coercion was suspected, responsibility fell downward. Church records speak of seduced nuns far less often than fallen women. Language that erased power imbalance while preserving male authority. This imbalance was structural, not accidental. Clergy were assets. They administered sacraments, maintained parishes, and upheld church operations. Nuns, by contrast, were contained dependents. Their worth was in being obedient and not being seen. When there was a fight, institutions protected what they needed the most. Punishment also showed what people thought about temptation. Church writers often wrote about women as being morally weaker, more emotional, and more likely to give in to their desires. This belief made it okay to be stricter with punishment. If women were inherently stable, then stringent control was a form of compassion in disguise. The reasoning was circular and very bad. Class was important, even in convents. A nun from a noble family might get, being kept in instead of being kicked out. Her family could step in, talk things over, or put pressure on her. Poor nuns didn't have these kinds of shields. They became easy examples of disorder, taking punishment that was meant to reassure those in charge. The unfairness went beyond punishment and into memory. Men who were involved in scandals often disappeared from records without a name or trace. Women are still recorded in painful detail, and their punishment is still remembered, but men's responsibility is fading. History remembers imbalance because the system kept track of it. Unequal punishment was not a problem with convent discipline. It was one of the most important parts of it. Fear worked best when it only went one way, and nuns had to bear the full weight of their sins. The church kept order, protected its reputation, and made sure people obeyed. Justice was not blind in medieval convents. It knew who it could afford to lose. One of the most interesting things about convent punishment is how often it was harsher than secular justice. Outside the cloister, even serious crimes were subject to established laws, deadlines, and occasionally negotiation or clemency. Inside the convent, discipline was strict, unbreakable, and not open to outside criticism. In a town court, a woman who was accused could appeal to her family, follow local customs, or even run away. And none of them could do any of these. Once she was locked up, she lived under a different set of laws, where abbesses and bishops were in charge of all social matters. Punishment wasn't measured in days or fines, but in how obedient and submissive someone was. Ideas that don't have a clear end. Secular prisons were tough, but people saw them as punishment. Discipline in the convent was seen as a way to fix things. This distinction was significant because punishment was characterized as spiritual medicine. It wasn't necessary to limit how long or how bad it was. If suffering persisted, it was deemed essential. If the nun broke down, that was proof of guilt, not too much. Sometimes secular law would have been more kind. A woman is accused of sexual misconduct outside A. The convent might have made her feel ashamed in public or fined her, but she could still move around and start over. A nun could be locked up for life, erased, or left alone. The church punished not just the action, but also the person. This was meant to be harsh. Discipline was used by convents to keep up the appearance of holiness. The whole system got weaker when vows could be broken without serious consequences. Fear kept things in order, and severity kept fear alive. It's funny that the church is so strict about discipline within its own ranks. Sometimes they protected nuns from violence in the world, but they lost their freedom. A nun avoided being publicly executed or beaten by agreeing to suffer in silence for a longer time behind walls. Mercy and cruelty were mixed up. Without supervision, abuse was easy. The inspections were only about following the rules, not about health. People who complained were seen as defiant. Appeals got lost in the hierarchy. Discipline became self justifying. Convent punishment was not visible, not limited in time, or not limited in space, and impossible to question. There was no public record of cruelty, just silence. And in a lot of ways, that made it work much better. The cloister said it would keep people safe from the outside world. For nuns who had done something wrong, it gave them something else, a justice system with no way out. Fear was the unspoken goal of every punishment. The discipline of medieval convents was not meant to help people become more moral or heal. It was made to stop things from happening again. And fear, which was carefully cultivated, turned out to be more reliable then. Only faith. Each punishment, whether it was isolation, hunger, humiliation, enclosure, or expulsion, had two purposes. It fixed the person and taught the whole community. Nuns learned not only what was wrong, but also what would happen if they crossed lines that weren't visible. People didn't often talk about the details, but they understood the consequences through absence, silence, and whispered knowledge. Fear changed how people acted long before any promises were broken. It made it harder to make friends. It made speech less extreme. It made people less likely to get emotionally attached. Nuns. They learned to control themselves not because they agreed with the rules, but because going against them was dangerous. Discipline worked best when it was no longer needed. This system also kept the stability of the institution. By making punishment severe and hard to predict, authority stayed strong. There was no need for the abbess to threaten. She had already internalized her power. Obedience became second nature. The sad thing is that fear lasted longer than guilt. Even nuns who never broke their vows were always watching themselves. Joy started to doubt. Love became dangerous. Being quiet became safe. The convent got people to do what they wanted by making them anxious, not by being holy. Writers from the church called this order. Historians think of it as control. The system worked, but it cost people their lives, which is not often noted in modern records. Pain did not leave of any scars that could be seen. Fear didn't leave any papers. It lived in how it acted. In medieval convents, punishment was common. It was the base. It changed how people lived, how they related to each other, and who they were. The threat was more important than the action. Most nuns obeyed not because they were holy, but because they knew what would happen if they didn't. In the end, convent discipline shows something that isn't easy to deal with. Fear is often used by institutions that expect perfection to keep it going. The walls stayed up and the rules stayed in place, but they didn't just protect purity. It was power that came from the quiet understanding that breaking a promise could mean losing everything. Love was not often seen as soft or sentimental in ancient times. It was seen as a force that broke up families, twisted reason, and ruined lives that had been carefully planned. Desire was not idealized as fate. People were afraid of it because it was chaotic. People in the past didn't ask if love was beautiful. They wanted to know how to live with it, control it, or use it as a weapon. Greek and Roman writers said that love was like a disease that got into the body without permission. Plato likened it to insanity. Doctors wrote about love sickness as a real medical condition with symptoms like insomnia and loss of appetite, being obsessed, shaking, and sad. If love could make you sick, it could also make you better. This idea led to the creation of aphrodisiacs, charms, and elixirs that were meant to spark, change, or increase desire. People thought that attraction worked on more than one level at a time. It moved through fluids, breath, smell, and heat in the body. It was affected by the gods, especially Aphrodite, OS, and later Venus and Cupid, who were thought to attack without warning. When divine forces were at work, humans stepped in, felt not only right, but also needed. If the gods made love, people would fight back with rituals, ingredients, and formulas. This made love very useful. People often set up marriages. Affairs were risky. If a seduction fails, it could ruin someone's social life. If it works, it could change who gets the money, who they work with, or who has power. Winning love wasn't just about the person, it was planned, so lovers turned to drugs that they thought would help them win. Markets sold roots, powders, animal products, and wines that made people want them. Midwives, healers, and wise women gave advice on matters of the heart. Recipes circulated quietly, often disguised as medical advice or religious practice. Some promised irresistible attraction. Some said they could bring back lost passion or keep a lover for good. It didn't matter if these things really worked by today's standards. Belief was what mattered. If desire was physical, then ingesting the right thing made sense. If attraction was magical, then ritual was as important as chemistry. Love became something that could be brewed, swallowed, worn, or whispered into existence. In a world without romantic certainty, aphrodisiacs offered hope. They gave lovers the illusion of control over something terrifyingly unpredictable. Love in antiquity was not trusted, it was managed. Mandre was one of the most interesting and scary aphrodisiacs in ancient times. This strange path, which often looked like a human body, was somewhere between medicine, magic, and a nightmare. Mandre didn't just look alive to people in ancient times, it behaved as if it were. Greek and Roman writers believed Mandre carried potent sexual and emotional power. The shape of it looked like a human body, which made it a clear choice for changing desire. Sympathetic magic says that things that are similar can affect each other, like a root that looks like a body. People thought that Mandre could make people want to have sex, make them fertile again, and bring lovers together with almost unstoppable force. Harvesting it was considered dangerous. Legends warned that Mandre screamed when pulled from the earth, a sound so deadly it could kill the listener. To avoid this fate, elaborate rituals were prescribed. Dogs were sometimes tied to the root and encouraged to pull it free, while the harvester stood at a safe distance, preferably with ears covered. Whether anyone actually believed the scream was lethal mattered less than the ritual itself. Fear amplified belief. Once obtained, Mandre could be prepared in multiple ways. It was dried and ground into powders, steeped in wine, or mixed into ointments. Small doses were believed to arouse desire or induce deep sleep. Larger doses were known to be dangerous. Ancient physicians were aware that Mandre could cause hallucinations, paralysis, and even death. This only enhanced its reputation. A substance powerful enough to harm must also be powerful enough to seduce. Mandre blurred the line between love potion and poison. This ambiguity made it useful in both seduction and control. Some recipes aimed to inflame passion, others aimed to dull resistance. The difference was often a matter of dosage, not intention. Love in this context was not always mutual. Men's literary works often linked women to the use of mandrake. The root turned into a sign of dangerous female knowledge, a plant that was connected to sex, reproduction, and manipulation. Men wanted it just as much, hoping to get back their manliness or find love. Mandre's strength came from both its chemistry and its myth. It represented the ancient belief that desire could be called up from the earth itself. Like the root, love had to be dug up, fought for, and handled with care, or it would turn on you. If Mandre symbolized mysterious desire, bull's blood represented something far more aggressive. In antiquity, the bull was the ultimate emblem of masculine power. Strength, fertility, dominance, and uncontrollable force. Consuming anything derived from a bull was believed to transfer those qualities directly into the body. Blood, the essence of life itself, was thought to be especially potent. Ancient sources mention bull's blood in unsettling ways. Some texts describe it as a powerful aphrodisiac capable of igniting overwhelming sexual drive. Others warned that it was deadly poison. Both ideas existed side by side, and this contradiction did not weaken belief. It strengthened it. A substance that could kill was assumed to also possess extreme power. Love and death were often imagined as neighbors. In practice, actual bull's blood was dangerous to consume due to coagulation and toxicity. Ancient physicians knew this, which suggests that many bulls' blood elixir were symbolic, diluted, or substituted with safer ingredients associated with bulls, such as organs, fat, or wine, dedicated through ritual sacrifice. What mattered was not biological accuracy, but symbolic transfer, strength in, weakness out. Bull imagery was a big part of fertility rituals in Greece, Rome, and the Near East. Blood from sacrifices was given to gods who were connected to desire and reproduction. Drinking or touching consecrated liquid was believed to bind the participant to divine potency. In this context, aphrodisiacs were not merely chemical aids, they were religious acts. Unlike Mandre, bull's blood was overwhelmingly associated with male sexuality. It promised dominance rather than attraction, conquest rather than persuasion. The goal was not mutual desire, but overwhelming force of presence. A man did not want to be loved, he wanted to be impossible to resist. This reveals an uncomfortable truth about ancient aphrodisiacs. Many were not designed to enhance shared intimacy. They were designed to overcome reluctance, fatigue, or social barriers. Desire was something to be provoked, even imposed rather than negotiated. Stories of bull's blood appear frequently in cautionary tales. Men who sought unnatural virility often met tragic ends. Consumed by the very power they tried to absorb, these stories functioned as warnings disguised as myths. Desire pursued through excess leads to ruin. Bull's blood, whether literal or symbolic, embodied an ancient fear. Love, amplified by force, did not remain controllable. Once unleashed, it threatened the body, the mind, and the order of society itself. While Mandre and bull's blood belong to the darker edge of ancient aphrodisiacs, oysters occupied a far more acceptable place at the table. They were sensual without being overtly dangerous, luxurious without appearing magical, and most importantly, edible. In antiquity, oysters became the respectable face of desire. The association began with the sea. Aphrodite, goddess of love, was born from the foam of the ocean. Anything drawn from the water carried erotic symbolism by default. Oysters, hidden inside rough shells and revealed only when pried open, seemed designed for metaphor. Ancient writers rarely resisted the comparison. Closed, modest, and plain on the outside, soft, moist, and suggestive within. Greek and Roman elites believed oysters stimulated desire through abundance and richness. They were expensive, transported alive over long distances, and served fresh at banquets where excess was part of the fun. Of the appeal, eating oysters was a sign of wealth, free time, and indulgence, all of which were thought to help romance. Oysters did not promise to change you like some stronger aphrodisiacs do. They said they would be ready. A body well fed, warmed by wine, and softened by luxury was assumed to be more receptive to pleasure. Desire was not forced into existence, it was coaxed out through comfort. Roman authors such as Pliny the Elder praised oysters for their invigorating properties, while sadists mocked men who consumed them obsessively in pursuit of sexual stamina. The joke worked because the belief was widespread. Everyone knew what oysters were for, even if no one said it directly. Oysters also allowed women participation without suspicion. Drinking Mandre wine raised eyebrows. Serving oysters at dinner did not. This made them socially useful. Desire could be cultivated without appearing desperate or dangerous. Aphrodisiacs worked best when they blended into everyday life. Yet oysters still carried moral tension. Excessive indulgence was linked to decadence, softness, and loss of discipline. Philosophers warned that constant stimulation weakened character. Desire, once awakened too easily, became difficult to restrain. Even the safest aphrodisiac carried risk. Oysters reveal something essential about ancient love culture. Not every desire was conjured through incantations or sanguine means. Much of it was nurtured through environment, status, and sensory pleasure. The ancient world knew something that people today often forget. Attraction thrives when the body feels secure, fed, and indulged. In the end, oysters did not promise magic. They promised mood, and in antiquity, Mood was half the battle. Beyond roots, blood, and seafood, ancient lovers turned to something far less tangible: magic. Love was not only consumed, it was invoked. Elixirs, charms, and whispered formulas formed an entire underground economy of desire operating at the edges of religion, medicine, and superstition. These elixirs rarely relied on a single ingredient. Recipes combined herbs, wine, honey, oils, ash, hair, nail clippings, and bodily fluids. What mattered was not flavor or safety, but symbolism. Each component carried meaning: honey for sweetness, wine for warmth, and hair for a personal touch. Mixing them created a physical representation of emotional intention. Words mattered as much as substances. Ancient magical papyri contain love spells that sound like people begging the universe for help. They said the names of gods over and over. Commands were spoken aloud. Some spells demanded obedience from the target, instructing them to feel burning desire, sleepless longing, and unbearable attraction until union was achieved. Love was framed as compulsion, not choice. These practices crossed social boundaries. Enslaved people, courtesans, soldiers, merchants, and elite women all used love magic. It thrived precisely because official society offered few acceptable ways to pursue desire freely. When marriage was arranged and reputation fragile, magic offered secrecy and hope. Women appear, frequently in surviving sources, as practitioners, though this reflects male anxiety as much as reality. A woman who used love magic was portrayed as dangerous, manipulative, and unnatural, but the spells themselves show weakness. Many people don't want to be in charge. They just want love, comfort, or to not be alone. Magic was a way to feel powerful, but it was also a way to control others. People usually took elixirs secretly by mixing them into drinks, putting them on their skin, burning them, or breathing them in. Consent was rarely considered. The goal was effect, not ethics. If desire could be triggered without the target's awareness, it was considered effective, not immoral. Authorities distrusted love magic intensely. Greek philosophers dismissed it as deception. Roman law occasionally prosecuted it as harmful sorcery, especially when outcomes turned violent or obsessive. This reinforced its reputation. Forbidden tools always feel more powerful. What these elixir reveal is not ancient ignorance, but ancient anxiety. Love was unpredictable, dangerous, and socially risky. Magic offered the illusion of control over something terrifyingly uncertain. In a world without emotional freedom, whispered words and secret mixtures felt safer than honesty. Desire, once again, was not trusted to emerge on its own. It had to be summoned, commanded, or forced into being. Not all ancient aphrodisiacs were wrapped in magic or excess. Some were definitely part of medicine. Ancient doctors thought that desire, like any other physical state, could go out of balance. Balance. Too much passion weakened the body, too little signaled illness. Love, when unmanaged, became pathology. Greek medical writers described lovesickness as a real condition, not a metaphor. Patients suffered from insomnia, loss of appetite, erratic behavior, and obsessive thoughts focused on a single person. Physicians did not dismiss this as poetry. They diagnosed it. The body, they believed, was overwhelmed by heat, dryness, or imbalance of humors. The treatment was different. At times, the cure was satisfaction. If desire made someone sick, giving into it could bring things back to normal. This advice was dangerous, especially for women and enslaved people who couldn't follow it because they didn't want to or because of their situation. When union was not possible, doctors used substitutes. Doctors told people to drink wine with herbs in it to warm their blood and calm their nerves. Some foods were suggested to help with circulation or to help people who are emotionally rigid. Baths, massages, and scented oils were helpful. It was thought that smell could make people want things directly without using reason. As much as they were luxuries, fragrant oils and incense were also medical tools. Some treatments were meant to lower desire instead of raising it. Love was helpful when both people felt it. It was dangerous when it was obsessive. Doctors had to be careful not to encourage or stop attraction. Aphrodisiacs and anaphrodisiacs coexisted, both presented as health interventions. What stands out is how physical the old idea of love was. The heart wasn't the only place where emotion lived. It went through blood, breath, and temperature. The feeling would follow if the body could be changed. This reasoning made aphrodisiacs seem respectable. They weren't spells, they were orders. This medical framing also protected desire. A lover was not lenient. He or she was taking care of a sick person. The language of health hid the need for longing. Lovesickness shows how seriously people in the past took desire. It had the power to kill, heal, or eat. Aphrodisiacs were not luxuries. They were actions taken in a world where love was dangerous, made things less stable, and couldn't be ignored. Not giving it to desire was not a good thing in ancient times. Taking care of it was necessary for survival. Aphrodisiacs in ancient times were never neutral tools. They worked within systems of power, status, and inequality, and the risks of using them were not always the same for everyone. Wanting something might have been universal, but acting on it had different effects on different people. For wealthy men, aphrodisiacs were luxuries. If a potion didn't work, it could mean shame, wasted money, or being made fun of in a funny way. For women, people who were enslaved, the stakes were much higher for those who didn't have protection. If someone thinks you used love magic, it could ruin your reputation, get you in trouble with the law, or even lead to violence. In one situation, the same act seemed like playful excess, but in another, it was dangerous manipulation. In hostile sources, aphrodisiacs were often linked to women. Male writers depicted them as clandestine potion brewers, corrupting men through unnatural methods. This story was based on fear, not truth. Women frequently possessed limited legitimate avenues to pursue. Want something, turn down unwanted attention, or get out of arranged marriages. In a world that was against them, aphrodisiacs and love magic gave them an edge. People who were enslaved were in an even more dangerous situation. Others controlled their bodies, but they were blamed for wanting them. Aphrodisiacs are mentioned in sources as things that can help you stay alive or get at you in trouble. Someone who is enslaved might use a potion to get favor or protection, while being accused of seduction to justify punishment. Desire turned into a problem they couldn't. Say no. Power also affected agreement. A lot of aphrodisiacs were given to people without their knowledge. When added to wine, food, or oils, they made it hard to tell the difference between attraction and coercion. People in ancient times didn't often question this. Wanting something was more important than agreeing. People looked at the effect, not the ethics, to see if they were successful. This imbalance is what made aphrodisiacs both popular and scary. They put social order at risk by ignoring the hierarchy. If desire could be chemically or magically induced, then class, gender, and authority lost some of their power. Of their power. Even though aphrodisiacs were used by a lot of people, that possibility made them feel subversive. Laws sometimes went after love magic, but they weren't always enforced. Punishment came after the scandal, not because of it. Once more, status decided the outcome. Risk was taken on by power. Aphrodisiacs show a harsh truth about love in the past. Wanting was not just for oneself, it was political, and tools meant to spark passion often showed who could afford to want freely and who had to pay for it later. Not everyone in ancient times believed in, without a doubt, aphrodisiacs. Along with recipes and rituals, there was also a tradition of doubt, ridicule, and quiet skepticism. Philosophers, physicians, and satirists frequently regarded love potions as indicators of desperation rather than as symbols of power. Greek philosophers like Hippocrates and later medical writers said that many so called aphrodisiacs worked more through suggestion than chemistry. If a lover thought a potion would make them feel passionate, their body might respond in kind. This did not make the effect meaningless, but it did change responsibility from the substance to the intellect. In this view, desire was psychological before it was physical. Roman satirists eagerly embraced this concept. Wealthy men who chased virility through oysters, rare wines, and exotic powders became common characters. They were made fun of for being silly, old, and scared of getting worse. Aphrodisiacs were more about feeling insecure than being powerful. The joke worked because the people in the audience could relate to what was going on. Some doctors openly warned against extreme treatments, things like Mondre and Bull. It was agreed that derivatives were dangerous. It was foolish, not heroic, to pursue love by poisoning the body. Too much stimulation hurt health, made people less rational, and made them obsessed instead of satisfied. But doubt never stopped the practice. It existed alongside belief. Even people who were unsure about certain ingredients usually agreed with the general idea. Mood, environment, and expectations all played a role. A potion might not work chemically, but it could work socially by showing intent, effort, or seriousness. This tension shows something significant. Aphrodisiacs didn't have to work all the time to stay popular. They had to give people hope. In a world where love was uncertain and rejection was expensive, any tool that promised an advantage was worth having. Satire also had a protective role. Elite men made fun of aphrodisiacs to show that they weren't weak. Making fun of someone turned their anxiety into laughter. It seemed less scary to joke about love. But skepticism didn't usually apply to women or other groups that were already on the outside. Doubt was a luxury. Those people in power could afford to dismiss aphrodisiacs as nonsense. People who didn't have power used them as a strategy. In the end, ancient people understood a paradox that still holds true. You can't completely control desire, but you can change it. Aphrodisiacs were on the line between hope and delusion, and people both made fun of and believed in them. That was enough to keep them alive. When the dust settles, old aphrodisiacs tell us more about fear than they do about chemistry. Mandre, bull's blood, oysters, and whispers. Spells weren't just ways to get someone to like you. They were reactions to a world where love was dangerous, reputation was weak, and options were few. Aphrodisiacs promised control in situations where it was hard to find. They gave people something to do when being honest was risky, not knowing if they would agree, and saying no was expensive. What they stood for was more important than what they did. Action instead of waiting, intervention instead of being helpless. People in ancient times didn't think love should be spontaneous and pure. They thought it was dangerous and disruptive. If not controlled, it destroyed families, made politics less stable, and made discipline weaker. Aphrodisiacs were attempts to control that power and direct it toward outcomes that were acceptable or at least survivable. Some ingredients had real effects on the body. Some people only relied on faith. The majority were in the middle. Ancient thought didn't separate medicine, magic, and manipulation the way modern culture does. This made the line between them very thin. The body and mind were not able to be separated. Experience was shaped by what people expected. There is also an uncomfortable truth behind the romance. Many aphrodisiacs were created not to increase mutual desire, but to eliminate hesitation. In ancient love culture, the end result was more important than morals. It was not possible to negotiate attraction, it had to be created. That way of thinking affected the choices of ingredients and the ways they were used. Aphrodisiacs are dangerous, but they also show how weak people can be. They show people who are scared of being unwanted, getting old, being ignored, or not able to do anything. They show longing dressed up as ritual and fear dressed up as confidence. Someone was hoping not to be turned down behind every potion. In the end, old aphrodisiacs didn't make love happen. They made sure people believed, belief that desire could be changed, belief that what you do matters, the idea that love, which is scary and out of control, could be shaped. That idea was strong enough to last for hundreds of years.